welcome guests, and thank you for our guests from MITRE and from Penten. I'm Andrew Cox, and I'm one of the leaders of the Active Cyber Defence Alliance, which is an Australian special interest group focused on fostering the adoption of active cyber defence measures, which I'll talk to a little bit more about in a moment. And we're joined today by some of the representatives of an American organisation, MITRE Engage Group, which they'll also introduce themselves a little more in a minute. And so let me move to the next slide, which is the agenda for today. And I'm going to do introductions in just a moment. We will have a question time, and you can put questions in the chat line as we go. Generally, I'll hold questions till the end, but I've given Phil the discretion that if there's a very pertinent question that we feel ought to be answered in context, then we will interject and include that in the panel session. We're going to look at the question of how active cyber defense measures work throughout the phases of an incident, both in the before phase, the during and the after phase, and then talk about conclusions. And today we're going to be focusing on the lapsus attacks and the tools and techniques and procedures that they have used to successfully breach some pretty notable victims. So let me introduce to you our panelists. Maretta Morowitz, who's lead cybersecurity engineer at MITRE, focused on adversary engagement, malware analysis, and reverse engineering. She's a founding member of MITRE's cyber deterrence and adversary management team, and she's worked particularly to break down collaboration barriers across public and private sector to enable the adoption of adversary engagement. She also says that outside of work, you can find Maretta hanging out with her dog, Hedgehog, at the dojo, possibly snorkeling, and curled up with a good book or eagerly awaiting by the mailbox for her Hogwarts letter. Gabrielle, I haven't got so much about, but she is the principal cybersecurity engineer at MITRE. Ben Whitham is co-founder of Penten and responsible for their artificial intelligence program. He's a cybersecurity entrepreneur who's had a career in the military and also been a consultant to Australian government commercial incident response teams. So in his new venture, Penten, he's working to create next generations of cyber deceptions to help protect business data and to detect and to track intruders. And Phill Moore is a seasoned technology leader, consultant, architect, and trusted advisor, works with, as an associate of mine in the practice Avantgard. And he's been an advisor to Fortune 500 companies and has a lot of experience, pardon me, across cloud software and right through identity management, hybrid services, ultimately to overseeing security frameworks for governance, risk, and compliance. So let me just start by why active cyber defense. One of my mentors took me aside one day and said to me, Andrew, the way that you guys are doing cybersecurity is like a blind boxer in a boxing ring. He's got a blindfold on and he's got his ear plugged, so he can't see or hear what's coming. He might be a really good boxer and very strong and skillful, but he's only ever going to land the occasional lucky punch, basically because he doesn't have the initiative and he doesn't know what's going on. He's basically always going to get beaten. And that's why you need to have your eyes open and be actually looking to engage your adversary and take initiative on your adversary. So one of the things that caused the formation of the Active Cyber Defence Alliance was a speech that I heard by retired Major General Marcus Thompson when he did the official opening for Queensland University's cyber degree. And he put up his 4 pillars of cyber defence. Self-defence, which is not using stupid passwords, not clicking on stupid links, and definitely not taking a selfie of yourself in front of the battle map when you're on manoeuvres and posting it to Facebook, which apparently happened once upon a time. And then there's the passive defense, which is what we call cybersecurity, these two domains, which is essentially cyber hygiene, patching, whitelisting, firewalls, virus scanning, endpoint detection and response, all the things we do reactively. Then he moves to the active defense, which I'll come back to. There is an area of offensive activity, and I'm not talking here about registered pen testing, but the kind of a work that the Australian Signals Directorate does in Australia and Defence can do when we actually go out and go after adversaries in a warfare-like situation. That's the exclusive domain of the security agencies, and obviously As civilians, we're completely blocked out of that space. But in between those is this uncomfortable gray zone, which we call active defense. Broadly, it's using intelligence measures and cyber deception, because cyber deception enables you to acquire intelligence that you can't get by any other means. It includes active threat hunting and lawful countermeasures. And I stress lawful, and we're not going to really focus on this today, but there's a lot that we can do within the law to defend ourselves. And Microsoft is really showing the way globally with this in the legal botnet takedowns that they've been doing. So broadly speaking, we believe that we need to get onto the front foot with cyber and start to engage our adversaries rather than simply react to them as we've been doing historically. And that's the mission of the Active Cyber Defense Alliance. We're joined today with representatives from MITRE. So I'm just going to ask Maretta Morowitz, who's with us, to speak to MITRE and how you play in this space.
Thank you. So for MITRE the MITRE Corporation operates a number of FFRDCs, and that's just a complicated way of saying we occupy the space between government and the private sector. And our goal is to, through those FFRDCs, or federally funded research and development centers, to be able to enable the US government and our partners to be able to do systems engineering, prototyping, all the different kinds of spaces that are a little bit more researchy than maybe the private sector is quite at, and a little bit less researchy and more applied than where some of our academic partners are. And so we sort of occupy that space in the US government world. Stepping back from that, MITRE also has a number of different efforts to enable cybersecurity and a whole bunch of other different technology areas for the private sector. And our mission statement really is for a safer world. And so we have a number of things such as MITRE Attack, which is all about documenting adversary behaviors, MITRE Engage, which I'll talk about in a minute, Caldera, which does adversary emulation. And these are all open source tools that are available for use. We also have a number of efforts through something called MITRE Ingenuity, which is our private sector facing organization, which does a lot of work in threat-informed defense and building up a community of threat-informed defenders. So that's sort of a 10,000 foot level view of what the MITRE Corporation is and what we do. Specifically, MITRE Engage is my team and Gabby's team. And so we work in the areas of cyber denial, deception, and adversary engagement. And I love that metaphor of the two boxers. A lot of times when we're thinking about, so as I said before, I work in the dojo a lot, I do martial arts. And so I like to think about denial as when you're blocking a punch or stopping a kick, right? It's that really direct action that you're taking. On the other hand, the cyber deception adversary engagement is when you're redirecting or using your opponent's strengths against them, right? So if you think of judo and jiu-jitsu, right? All these different martial arts that capitalize on that. And so really what we're doing with MITRE Engage is bringing those two pieces together. So stopping and blocking what we can, but then redirecting and reutilizing our adversaries' own, behaviors against them. And so I'm sure we're going to talk a lot more about what that all means today. But at a high level, MITRE Engage is a framework that's built to enable private sector defenders, decision makers, and the vendor communities to be able to plan and discuss how adversary engagement fits into their own operational or their strategies and into their organizations.
Thanks, Maretta. I should also mention that the Australian government recently signed a high-level agreement with the MITRE Corporation for information exchange, which I understand is part of the AUKUS arrangements. So we're going to be seeing a lot more of MITRE in Australia in the coming years to come as the geopolitical situation hots up, and that's both across the defence and the civilian sector. So really welcome your involvement, and it's great getting to know you guys. So let us.
MITRE has.
Sorry, Maretta.
I was just going to say MITRE actually has, two new big efforts. One is in South Australia and then another working in Canberra. And so it's really exciting. We're going to have, I believe they just are starting to build up the workforce in Australia. So really excited to be more part of the Australian cyber community.
So to give some kind of context to what we're going to talk about today, we thought we'd pick a difficult attacker, somebody that has really succeeded in circumventing the controls of some pretty significant organizations. In this case, the Lapsus Group. The other thing about the Lapsus Group is they have a wide portfolio of tools, techniques, and procedures that they use throughout the attack. So I've structured today's session as a panel session and really allowing the panel to speak to various phases of the attack and just drawn the tools and techniques and procedures from these various articles. By the way, the slide pack will be available later on if you would like to reach out to me. And we will be putting a video of this session up onto the LinkedIn event page for the Active Cyber Defence Alliance in due course once we've completed the process. So the thing about lapsus, the way we're going to do this, we're going to look at their techniques at the various phases of the attack. During the prior phase, when they were doing their reconnaissance and social engineering, bribing insiders, etc. During the during phase, after they've actually succeeded in achieving a breach, and the various techniques that they use to develop their attack inside of the victim's environment. And then in the after phase, after they'd been detected and there was an incident response process, mitigation, assurance of eradication, and trying to clean up and mitigate the damage that was caused. So we'll keep things moving, but the idea of this is to give you a taste of how these active measures could be applied in these various phases and give defenders some real options rather than simply being reactive continually throughout the process. So look at the prior phase. So the interesting thing about lapsus is the diversity of their techniques. In fact, this is a screenshot of an actual advertisement that they placed online to bribe people to give their credentials away, and naming the specific companies that they're targeting. And it's like a CISO's worst nightmare to see that kind of ad going out there, but that's the kind of thing we're dealing with. And this is very public, but we have to confront the fact that this is going on in a less public way as well. So I'm going to throw the floor open now for the moment, and I'll stop sharing my content so that we can see people's faces a little better. For the social engineering and reconnaissance, so Lapsus has decided to come against my organization. They're going out there and they're exploring the LinkedIn profiles, the Facebook profiles, the org chart of the organization. They're trying to figure out who's who in the zoo and how they can best attack my organization. How do we prepare for that? And let me throw to you, Maretta, in the first place.
Yeah, so I think that there's a lot there, right? And I think step number one, whenever you're starting to think about how do I get started, is to really start with defining your goals. And so that's something that with Engage, we talk about all the time, is that step one, before you ever try just throwing deception into your network, is really sitting there and saying, what am I doing this? Why am I doing this? And what am I trying to achieve as an outcome? And then using that to form the rest of your plan, right? And so when you think about this, right, that was a pretty hefty list. It was supply chain, it was insider threat, it was social engineering, right? There was a whole bunch of places, and any one of those could send you down a rabbit hole of just adding new deceptions and new technologies without ever kind of stopping and coming up and saying, have I actually done something that helps me towards my goal? So I would say step number one is to say, what do I think my biggest risk is? Is it insiders? Is it external threats? Is it, phishing and social engineering? Is it supply chain? Once you've decided sort of where you want to start focusing, that should help you kind of keep moving down that path. And so the next question is, all right, let's say in this case, we're going to say that social engineering, phishing, that's what I've decided is my priority area. So step number one is starting to ask yourself, well, where am I now, right? Doing a bit of an assessment on your own organization, where your strengths and weaknesses lie at this point. How well trained are your people, right? Are people clicking on links every time they get one? Do you feel like you have that covered? Next thing is starting to say, what kind of effect do I want to have? Am I just trying to detect when bad things are happening? Am I trying to have some sort of impact when I receive some sort of social engineering effort or phishing or whatever it is? Am I going to try to learn more about and get more CTI about what I'm seeing in this space? And then depending on where you go from there, you can start taking your next steps. And I want to kind of wrap up a little bit because I know we have a bunch of other panelists, but I'll say, the step number one, once you've sort of defined that, is to really start thinking about your adversary as a person and thinking about it at the behavior level, right? And so once you start thinking about behaviors, you can start identifying opportunities. So what do I mean by that? Let's take phishing. So when someone sends a phishing email to me, the weakness there, or a weakness there, is that they lose control of the email, right? They send it, I receive it, it is out of their hands. It's in my control. And so whether I move that to a fake machine or a fake persona and detonate it, whether I, just completely throw it out. There's that denial. Whether I engage in some way by having these, separate environments or fake personas, I can really start thinking about all of these different behaviors and breaking them down as what's the behavior, what's the weakness, how can I take advantage? And I'll let Gabby dive more into sort of what that can look like in deception. But they're sort of setting the stage for making sure no matter what you do, that it is goal driven and goal oriented.
So Ben, let me just go to Ben next. We've got a situation where this sophisticated adversary is doing reconnaissance against my organization. How could I have prepared myself to defend that? How could I hold the initiative in this case?
Look, really good question, Andrew. I think, I'm from the military, so always try and have a military analogy here. For me, cybersecurity is just one of those really key things I think that epitomizes the arms race. I think the real danger we've got is that we take a very literal example like lapsus and then try and apply and plug the gaps there. So like Maretta said, I think what we really need to do is we know we're in an environment where, we build something clever and then somebody who's clever or industrious or both, shows us where we've gone wrong. And then we go and plug the gap there again. And so the danger is we just keep going round and round, trying to solve these things. And so really, I think it's about taking a step backwards and saying, okay, well, let's generalize what the problem is here. We know that they want to get access to our systems. They know they want to get access to our data. And then now we have that basis of knowledge. It's about understanding how we go about, as Maretta said, protecting ourselves. I do like the idea of a risk assessment process to help drive and prioritize what you're going to do for an active defense point of view. If you start with that and then truly do understand where your gaps are, so the risk assessment process will help you arrive at a point where you've got, areas of risk that you've yet to mitigate. And that's where I believe you should focus your active cyber defense in, is to, reduce that risk, the overall risk you've got. The second thing I'd say is that, is to be very, very careful when doing your plans about things, is to make sure you're truly understand the adversary that you're dealing with. It's very easy in the cybersecurity environment to pluck a particular problem, like a USB in the car park, and that ends up driving your whole paradigm of how you do things. And, one of the great things that MITRE has done for the community is put together the attack framework with a set of a description of the attackers, and modeling around an attacker is usually going to help you drive much more realistic scenarios to help identify, how you're going to practically mitigate against those particular risks as you go through that process. But I do echo, a lot what Maretta has said, build a framework to decide what you're going to prioritize first, make decisions around how much energy and effort you're going to place into it, make decisions about what you're going to do in the event of these things triggering, work out whether you're going to detect or you're going to create a CTI process, and then buy in the business to make sure that they understand and are happy with this process. The final thing I'll say is that the vast majority of work that we've done in this space has been shrouded by secrecy, and that's an important conversation to have. So many engagements that we have with organisations, only a very small number of people are briefed into the deception campaign, and it's making a decision at the beginning of that process who's going to be part of that active defence knowledge and solution, and then making sure that those people are available, and every other bit of communication that sits outside of that is represented as a real thing rather than leaks of that particular activity that you're going through.
Can I just add to that and just sort of take a step forward as well, from a solution and security architect perspective? Let's say I've done a risk assessment and I've indicated that my supply chain is probably one of the highest risks. And that's probably been attributed to supply chain attacks that have been happening and increasing over the last few years. Then I suppose if I take a step forward and say, okay, what are the techniques that I might use and consider to be used from an active point of view would be, maybe seeding breadcrumbs across endpoints that have deceptive, cached URLs that are monitored and triggered if an alert and alerted if those URLs are accessed. Deceptive cached user credentials, again, alerted if those credentials are used, or even potentially beacon files stored in non-standard locations on those file systems of those endpoints. Those are techniques that, I'm not saying that this is after, I suppose I'm moving forward here, this is after we've done the risk assessment and we've determined that supply chain, the supply chain is a high risk. So what are the techniques that we might use or consider from an active point of view? And so those techniques that I've just talked about, that's just a few, could be an early warning if a device is compromised, excuse me, within both my organisation and organisations that are providing a supply to me, across those that external infrastructure. So if you think about the Okta incident with Lapsus, that's exactly what happened. When a external provider for support had their device compromised. And then screenshots taken and released of access to some customer systems. So I'm just moving a bit forward here and giving some examples of what sort of active techniques might be available.
Thanks, Phil. And Gabby, I was going to throw it to you as well. At a practical level, then, I've done my assessment. Well, what's the kind of framework of active measures that I might prepare myself with in order to be able to detect and defend, this kind of sophisticated attack?
Yeah, I wanted to piggyback off of what Ben was saying, and I think, and Andrew, your boxing analogy, the world's best athletes in competitive sports study up on the tapes of their opponents, and that's really great if you have a wealth of opponent information to study up on. But if you don't have that, and for example, Ben, you're talking about all of this being shrouded in secrecy, you might not have a lot of knowledge about your threats. You might have a lot of information about your organization's risk assessment, but taking a step back and saying, okay, what threats are likely to be targeting me? What are those generalized approaches that they're going to be using? And Phil, you had some great examples there of how to take that, that weakness side, the targeting side, and Maretta was talking about the goals for your operations, kind of pulling those all together. You can start to plan what your deception is going to look like, whether that is in a production network where you're deploying decoy systems or artifacts potentially targeted at the interested areas that an advanced persistent threat is going to be looking to exfiltrate from your system or using when they are trying to do lateral movement. So putting together that game plan of like, okay, what do I think the adversary is going to do? Do they tend to punch harder with their, I'm not a boxer, so apologies if this this analogy falls flat, but do they tend to go left, right, left, or left, right, right? And if you can find a way to say, okay, well, if I see left, right, left, and I want to make them go left, left, right, what can I put in place as the defender to try to play into their cognitive biases or play into their tactics and techniques and procedures to influence their operations? So I think in addition to just the detection side, thinking about how can you impose cost on adversaries is a lovely way of putting together your strategy.
So Gabby, can you give us like a real life anecdotal example of a kind of tool that you might have deployed that might give you some insight that your supply chain's been breached, rather than finding out after they turn up inside your environment?
Yeah. Supply chain is a tricky one because you have a lot of different steps along the way. It could be in different countries. I think supply chain is one of the trickier aspects of applying deception to this security model. So, I mean, if you're thinking about opportunities to deceive people trying to impact your supply chain, I don't know, we get into a lot of discussions around the legality of deception, and depending on who you talk to, if they're lawyers or not, how far the misinformation that you could be spreading about what your supply chain looks like is something that I think, we could have a whole different roundtable discussion just around that.
Sure. I'm thinking along the lines of one incident I know of where a water treatment authority had external contractors maintaining all of their uh, industrial control systems who were dialing in via the internet. And they found, just by a legitimate document that they had to provide to these people, they put certain traces in there which would have been interesting to an adversary if those documents had been compromised, as some sort of a tool to be able to give them awareness. If that machine was breached by a third party, it's likely that they would have actually explored that document and perhaps touched some of the things in there which would have created some unusual behavior. So, I mean, I guess that's the kind of comment that I've seen in the space, but I do agree with you, it's a tricky one. But generally speaking, social engineering and reconnaissance is not that hard to detect, is it? What tools do you use to detect those? Maybe you could answer that one, Ben.
I'd say that's very hard to detect, actually. So, it's one of the really tricky spaces. So if you make a decision that you want to understand if someone is doing a reconnaissance process on you, and you've identified that as part of your risk assessment, that's an outstanding risk that you want to mitigate, and it's of importance for you to deploy, and you've got the resources to do it. One path to go down is to create, is to think back about what the adversary is after, right? And so they're after data in the end, and they're after access to your systems, and more than likely they're after a really strong footprint on your network in order to be able to conduct their operations. So, that's a truism generally of most of these cases. So what we can do is we can create fake artifacts in order to be seeded through that get picked up through the reconnaissance phase. So you could make a decision to create a set of fake personas within your organization, and make them publicly available or available in locations where that reconnaissance process is likely to occur, and then just see if there's any interactions with those. So that's a particular pathway. But, with many of these things, you're only really limited by your imagination. And I'll keep re-emphasizing that, and guided by your risk assessment process and the resources that you have available, because that process will tell you what's your highest priority problem to look at, and then where you should invest your limited resources to solve.
I'm going to add on to what Ben just said. So I think it's your risk assessment, your resource level, and your CTI availability, right? And your ability to identify target adversaries. It doesn't matter if you spend all the time and money that you have focusing on, APT 123. If APT 123 doesn't care about you, historically, then you've just wasted your time. And maybe you're really good now at defending against 123, but they target financial sector and your, healthcare. So having that deep understanding of what does the target landscape look like? What have you seen in the past? What have similar organizations to you seen in the past? And trying as much as possible to base on that sort of data and not just, whatever APT is in the news that day.
Okay, so in this case, let's move this forward. Our adversaries succeeded in their reconnaissance to the extent that they've reached the environment. They've got some legitimate credentials now, and they're monitoring our Slack channel and our GitHub and various other internal utilities to gather more information to enable them to move laterally, and also they're spying on our incident response. So what are the kind of options that you would think about, Maretta, in that context? To what kind of tools could you have in place that or approaches could you have that enable you to neutralize the effect of what the adversary is doing?
So this exact situation is actually how MITRE got started in deception a long time ago. We had an active intrusion, and our VP made at the time was a kind of radical decision that instead of just squashing everything they found, they were going to take some of the machines that they knew were infected, isolate them, and let things keep going, and use that to be able to identify, what sort of C2 traffic they were seeing, what lateral movement, where did they already have toeholds, what did they know, what did they not seem to know. And so there's a kind of an array of different things that you can do at this point by allowing things to keep going, but in safe and isolated ways. I'm going to preface this though with saying, before you do this, before you ever, is have the stakeholders in a room and have the conversation around what is acceptable behavior during an incident like this? What is an acceptable level of risk? What are the behaviors that if the compromised machine starts doing X, we immediately shut down what we're doing. If they start doing Y, we have, an all hands meeting and decide, are we going to allow this behavior to continue? So an example of that could be if from a compromised machine, they start reaching out to somewhere else in the internet and using you as a jump box to target somewhere else, then, you shut that down.
Okay.
Right. And so defining what those things are before the incident happens, so that you're not scrambling in the moment to say, are we okay with this happening or not, is super important. But yeah, there's a bunch of different opportunities that you can use to be able to understand the scope and extent of a breach. A really simple example could be scattering fake credentials. So if I have fake credentials and I put them and I know which machines have which credentials, and then I see those credentials used elsewhere in the network, that suddenly gives me a map to be able to go backwards and say, well, if they have this, they must have been here previously. Yep. So that's just one kind of small example of something you could do during a response situation.
Gabby, do you have something on that too?
Yeah, I don't know if you saw me scribbling notes down here. I wanted to piggyback off of one of the things that Maretta said about, when we are running operations, we put together a rules of engagement document where we go step by step with those stakeholders, with the operators to say, okay, if we see this, then what are the corresponding reactions? I think one to add on to that is really difficult to fully encapsulate everything that you and your team expect to see during an operation. So I think it's also really important to have a good understanding of what flexibility your team has, what additional options, how can your team be scrappy? And I think a level of improvisation around this all too, because you're only as good as what you know, and trying to encapsulate those unknown unknowns is particularly difficult. So I think this all goes back to deception and adversary engagement as a mindset. It's a way of thinking about the game that you're playing with the adversary. I also think that there's some fun room here to do some tabletop exercises if you have the opportunity to do that. And I know that kind of fits into the planning phase versus the during phase, because the during phase, it's very much heat of the moment. How are you responding? How are you pivoting to what your adversary is doing and what your responses are? So I think, my takeaway here is flexibility is really important, because even your best laid plans could go awry very quickly.
Yeah, look, I think one of the things that it really needs to be, your organisation needs to be aware of is, the level of maturity that your organisation has in terms of incident response as well. In many government organisations that I've been involved with, actually, taking an adversary that's attacking a device and then moving them to an isolated area wouldn't be considered, just because the level of maturity is just not there for them, and they're very risk averse. So.
And Ben, what have you got to comment on this?
So I'll echo all the comments that are made previously. So if the previous phase was the work phase, that is the time that you've already done your planning to work out what it is you want to do, what your organisation is comfortable, and your level of authority. That's done in the previous phase. If you're doing it during this phase, your scope's really limited, and the risk is higher, right? So the more you've done it in the work phase, the better you're going to be in the during phase. So one thing that wasn't mentioned was just covering some of those sort of areas that you probably want to be thinking about in your active defence, or tools that you've got. So, I like the concept of, in this particular adversary engagement, the power of decoys. So if we know they're after data, we know they're after credentials and further access in your organisation, and we know they're after systems that can give them persistence, right? So that gives us the ability to have a look at, let's create things that they're interested in that process, so that we can understand, firstly, detect if they're in, and then understand where they're going, and then further what they're after, to help us orientate around that particular threat. So I see this in 4 sort of areas. Firstly, we can create fake users or decoy users, decoy data, and decoy credentials or decoy systems. Okay. So there's some real tricks here in this process. So if you're thinking about decoy users, well, you can think about And I like with lapses, there's some great examples about, about their ability to poll and enumerate AD to find out things. So if we took it literally, we'd think of a particular tool. But if we're thinking about it in a broader sense, okay, well, they're going to be after those credentials in AD. So do we make those credentials? And the real key is how to make them realistic enough that they actually sit in the environment. So if your real users have names, job titles, phone numbers, and email addresses, then in the AD, you've got to create that backstory as well to make that work. And then you've got to make a decision whether you're actually going to create the phone numbers, the email accounts, etc., and watch those as well through the process. So you're not just literally taking the example from lapses. If you're thinking about data, well, that needs to be realistic once again. So that needs to align with the business. It needs to have content of interest that they'll go after. Otherwise, it will be a trap that's set in the wrong location. It needs to be somewhere where it can be found. And overlaying that, we have to think about how to manage some of the negatives associated with it. So we need to make sure that we're not going to impact real users when we do this, and we're not going to create false positives, or at least we've got some process or plan to how to manage that. Finally, there's decoy credentials. So that's different than the AD information that exists in AD. I'm talking about those credentials that also gain access to systems and services. And we need to think about where we can place those in an environment, but in the same context as data, realistic, somewhere where they can be accessed, and you're managing the limitations of that. And finally, there's decoy systems, and I think they fall into two categories: a low interaction decoy system, which is really gives you detection and detection only, and a higher end decoy system, which is an ability for you to gain intelligence through the process, which helps you in the next phase.
Okay, we're nearly out of time, and we want to finish on time, so I'm just going to go quickly to our last slide, which is okay. The damage has been done. What could we have done in that planning phase to put us in a better shape when the extortion note goes public, informing us that they've exfiltrated data and they're going to leak it if we don't pay the bribe? So let's touch that one. And what did we do back in the planning phase that set us up to be in a better position than we would have been otherwise?
Yeah, I think one important thing is, what sorts of ambiguity can you add to your environment, to your data? And anytime you add ambiguity, it slows the adversary down, because then they have to question. They can't take everything that they got at point value and say, okay, this is all good data. They then have to start going through and saying, is this real? Is this deception? And so, we talked briefly about the Macron campaign, where, if you just add some emails to a corpus of emails, and you can point to them and say specifically, these were not real emails, or these were not real accounts, then you make that equation stack really heavily against the adversary, because then they have to go through and validate. And that is often, enough of a cost to really put a wrench in their plans.
Okay. And we really are nearly out of time, but Maretta, I'd like to give you the final opportunity to speak and wrap this up for us today. Thank you.
Yeah, so at a high level, I would kind of break this. I love what Gabby said, and I would divide this into, there's things you can do to drive up their resource costs and drive down the value of their operations, right? So that's really what it all boils down to, is how do I make it so that the things they're taking from my environment are worth less, such as the Macron campaign, when those emails were leaked and no one cared. It didn't have the same effect as it really did to the Democratic campaign in the US. Right, we drove down the value of those resources. Two is driving up the cost of their operation. So like Gabby said, making things more confusing, take long, whether it's in the collection phase or in the processing and phase later on. How do you just waste the bad guy's time? And then the final section is, how do you learn better for the future, right? So how can you take the things you're seeing and be able to drive and inform your own defenses in the future? So that you can be better prepared by getting, that threat intelligence out of this. So I think those kind of, to me, are those main categories of what kind of can come out of this. So it's drive up the cost, drive down the value, and then help yourself learn.
One of
Thank
the
you so
one of the other things I'd like to add to just agree with all those, but the other part is the assurance. Have you actually removed the adversary, and how do you know that you have completely removed them from your environment?
Thank you, everybody, for your participation today. And the people who are going to watch this later on as video. You'll be able to meet us in person at the ACER conference, CyberCon in Melbourne in October. And I think both Gabby and Maretta and some of the other team are coming to join us. And together, the Active Cyber Defence Alliance and MITRE Engage have 3 presentations on the Wednesday morning. So it's going to be a big morning of active defence at CyberCon. So we look forward to seeing you all there. And thanks very much. Really appreciate Ben, Gabby, Maretta, and Phil for your help and your contribution today. All the best.